Welcome back to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and today we are looking at a news story coming out of Texas of a new planned Muslim community on some 400 plus acres outside of Dallas, Texas. Governor Abbott has tried to suspend and halt the purchasing of the land needed for this community on the grounds that the community violates both state and then federal law in trying to establish a community governed by Islamic law or Sharia law. To my knowledge, this is one of the first communities proposed here in the United States. And with the fall of some of the great Western nations, such as the UK, we can look to what the downstream effects of allowing Islamic law to rule in what the UK calls dead zones might look like in the coming years to decades. Now in the West and even in the UK, which is, the beacon and the theater of Enlightenment thought and Western culture, we've seen Muslims moving outside of the Middle East into Western nations, escaping authoritarian regimes and wars and oppression, but trying to reestablish the communities that they once lived in the Middle East in their new homes in the West. And while here in the West, and specifically in the United States, we protect freedom of religion and we encourage religious pluralism, you cannot then come and, by the protections and privileges of a democracy, try and establish Sharia law and recreate the communities that you once had in the Middle East in the West. You can still practice your religion, but you have to assimilate to at least the norms and the political and cultural expectations of living in the West. And we're seeing that clash of civilizations play out in Europe. And this news story just reminds us that if we're not vigilant here in the United States, it is coming for us as well. So before we get into today's episode, please like, comment, and subscribe to the Philos Project channel. And you can follow us on X and Instagram for more related content to what we talk about here on the podcast. Let's get into the episode. All right, so this news about a Muslim community in Texas is coming at a time when talks about the West and its clash with the Islamic world and the Islamic worldview, as many are living within the West and have established new Islamic communities in the West. Those conversations are now at the forefront when we look at countries like the UK, like Germany and Sweden, who, through and motivated by ideas that are inherently enlightened and cornerstone to the Western world of religious tolerance and even far left liberal ideas about open immigration and supporting and protecting the rights of religious minorities, have now created an immense problem and issue. Again, even if you look in Paris, of immigrants coming from the Islamic world and not just integrating, but also refusing to assimilate to the Western norms and values and ideas of these Western countries. Again, you look to the UK, it's the basket of Enlightenment thought. That's where the Enlightenment was birthed out of. And today we see Christians being persecuted. You're not allowed to pray in certain areas. You can be arrested for it. And then you look to Ramadan celebrations that were happening in the streets, and minority religious rights are afforded freedoms that Christians no longer have in their country of origin. And that is something to talk about. And it's a warning to America to not adopt the policies that the UK and other Western countries in Europe have allowed, because they're seriously being threatened. Brits might be a minority in their own country within the coming decades as a startling statistic. Because again, individuals moving to the UK from the Middle East are seeking to establish Muslim communities outside of the Middle East in the West. And that cannot happen. There has to be a fundamental understanding that if you're going to benefit from the privileges of the West, that you then have to respect those norms, values, and ideas. But that doesn't exist in the Islamic worldview. If you even look at Islam, Islam means submission to Allah. That is the authority in which these Muslim communities living in the West look to. It supersedes the Western norms of the countries they live in. So let's look at the news story that came out of Texas, and then we'll look at Governor Abbott's response, and then we'll even look to some examples in the UK of what not to do as kind of a warning to us here in the United States.
Developers don't build here. East Plano Islamic Center, or Epic City as it would be called, would be 400 acres just outside of Dallas. It would have about 1,000 homes. It's got parks, a school, a mosque. But Governor Greg Abbott has launched several investigations claiming they want to impose Sharia law or Islamic law.
Could look like we're showing you the video. According to the Epic,
I want to note as well, because I think the word impose is important. Individuals who are buying land in this community, it's not that they're imposing Sharia law. I think everyone who is a Muslim who would be moving into this community desires to be ruled by Sharia law. So it wouldn't be imposing Sharia law. It would essentially be a zone in which Sharia law is the governing authority, and it would supersede state and federal laws and the liberties afforded through state and federal laws. But the concept of this epic city is that people are opting into it because many Muslims living outside of the Middle East do desire to be governed by Islamic law, especially if they are recent immigrants, because again, that is cornerstone to their worldview. It's contrary to Western norms and ideas. So I thought that the word impose was interesting. I think everyone moving into this community would opt into it, but that still fundamentally cannot happen in Texas, and we'll get into that.
the Epic City website, the planned community would include 1,000 homes, a K through 12 faith-based school, a mosque, apartment shops, even a community college. Their attorney pointing out that this community will include professionals, doctors, politicians, even a mayoral candidate.
It would have a candidate for mayor. So essentially this would be governed as a Muslim community, as a community essentially like plucked out of the Middle East, placed in Texas. That's how it would be governed and operated on some 400 plus acres. And I think this highlights a desire by many immigrants to see their communities relocated in the West, but then again, refuse or reject or push back against Western norms and ideas. And I don't think this is restricted just to Muslim immigrants. If you look to the ICE deportation protests recently, you see a bunch of Mexican Americans protesting the police and the US government, waving Mexican flags, the flag of the country that they fled to come to America, the great country with the American dream. It's this rejection of assimilation that we also see of Hispanic communities, many of whom have fled their countries of origin as well for corruption, for quality of life, for economic reasons to then come to America. So we see this rejection as well. It's not just with the Muslim world. So I want to highlight that as well, but that still cannot happen. It's like the individuals we've talked about, the foreign students who get the privilege of coming to the United States and studying at Ivy League institutions, and through the protections afforded them by being student visa holders to freely assemble and espouse ideas that might be radical, but they are protected through freedom of speech, want to come to the United States and advocate for the demolition of the United States and the takedown of Christian norms in society and the reestablishment of some sort of neo-Marxist government. It's something that only happens and only by the privileges allotted in a democracy and by the United States that can happen in a country like the United States. You don't see students from the United States going to, let's even say like another Western nation, like studying abroad in Spain, and then joining protests to like take down the Spanish government. You don't see that happening in the reverse, but it's extremely prevalent with immigrants coming to the United States, whether they be students or whether they come and live in the United States. And so Governor Abbott said, absolutely not. And I'm sure there's going to be a long legal battle that will ensue over religious freedom. But Governor Abbott said, to be clear, Sharia law is not allowed in Texas, nor are Sharia cities, nor are no-go zones, which we see all over the UK, which this project seems to imply. Bottom line, the project as proposed in the video is not allowed in Texas. And we see in the UK, if we can contrast this with the UK, what that then looks like. So first, I want to look at the comment section of the video that I showed you. You had a pretty 50-50 response. Someone saying it would be the safest and most friendly city in America. Maybe the community looks kind of like what you would see in the UAE, right? I think the UAE is what a lot of people think Muslim communities look like in the Middle East, but the UAE is the exception, not the norm. Most Muslim countries in the Middle East are extremely unsafe, largely because there's not a monopoly on violence. in those countries by the government. Someone saying keep Texas Christian. So we're seeing that cultural, civilizational, and religious clash. People saying they thought that the laws or other courts can exist within the United States, which is true. And so the comment section was pretty evenly split. But we see this conversation about the fall of the West kind of moving more mainstream. And I want to play this clip because I think it really perfectly sums up where we are at and the clash between the West and the Islamic civilizational bloc. Samuel P. Huntington, who is the father of the clash of civilizations theory, kind of predicted this many, many decades ago. I would love to do a podcast episode on that, but we're seeing it play out in real time.
That really keeps you up at night, not just because of the event itself, but the implications of it.
Also, Ayaan Ali is a former, she's a refugee, but she came from Somalia. She then lived in the UK. I believe now she lives in the United States. She was a Muslim. Then she became, I believe, an atheist or agnostic. She was part of the new Christian atheist movement of like the 2010s. And then now she is a professing Christian. But she's seen firsthand and she has lived in the Islamic world, and she sees the oppression on women. She has many incredible books. One of them is called Pray. I highly recommend it. And so she is a staunch supporter of Western norms, values, and ideas, and pushing back against allowing those Islamic norms to then move into the West and create strongholds within Western societies and through political systems.
The fall of Europe. It's the fall of Europe, it's the fall of the United Kingdom is on the brink. The government of Sweden, the Prime Minister said a few weeks ago that he has lost control of the monopoly of violence. His government has lost control of the monopoly of violence. He was very honest, but I think in many ways that's where Germany is at, where France is at. And those countries falling like domino effects.
So I have recently been to the UK and also Germany. I went to Nerburgg to see some of the World War II sites where the Nuremberg trials were held. And when I got off of the train, the Nuremberg train station, I was shocked. It felt like and looked like I was in the Middle East. And that was kind of when I realized there's a lot of Syrian refugees in Germany because of the civil war, but there's just many refugees from the Middle East at large. The way I was being talked to, the way I was being looked at, I was very aware of the fact that I was not in the part of Germany that I had come from. And there was a stark contrast from the farm country that I was staying in with the large Muslim population in Nerburgg. And again, this is my personal experience. So I am not trying to then say this, is empirically factual, but even the worldview differences. Like I got into my taxi back to the train station and the taxi driver asked me about getting married and if he could have my Instagram. And I believe he even asked if I was a virgin. Like those kind of conversations typically don't happen in the West with your taxi driver. But the stronghold of the Islamic community in Nerburgg and also just the worldview that they hold to, they don't come to Europe and then develop some enlightenment heart and this burning passion for Western norms and ideas and individual freedoms and women's rights. They don't. Nothing changes for them. Geographically, they have moved, but they seek to establish their communities within the West, and they don't have tolerance either for Western norms and ideas. And even if they hold tolerance, they don't hold a desire to then also share those values, which Ayaan is saying in this video. And then this next part, I think, is really important because she talks about how they have done it. And also, the fact that the West could fall without a single shot, being fired in like a war is wild. If you go back to the Crusades, you see this push and pull between the Muslim Caliphate and the West and Christendom at the time before it was really called the West, and the battle for the Iberian Peninsula and trying to push the Muslims out of Europe and prevent them from infiltrating Europe, these were actual wars that were fought hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And now we see Muslims moving in and taking over culturally and politically, and not a single shot has been fired. This has happened through the belief that if we allow minorities to come into our countries, that they then will assimilate. And these are far left liberal ideas. And something else I think that exists is this relationship between the far liberal ideological left and the Islamic world, because they share a mutual desire to see the fall of Christendom and the rejection of Christian truth. And so this shared, resentment or desire to see it replaced with a different form of governance or different form of values, I think also makes unlikely allies between the ideological left and then the very conservative Islamic world. And I think you see that also happening in the United States as well on college campuses, supporting and being proponents of Hamas, even though there are great ideological contradictions between, Gays for Palestine and Hamas and their charter and what they espouse and believe through the enforcement of Sharia law, which isn't very friendly to gays. They share a mutual desire to see Israel fall and to see the West fall. And so there's also a very odd alliance there as well, which we'll look at in a second when we look to Christian persecution in the UK.
That is my nightmare. And they have done that through settlement, through infiltration in their institutions, including political.
And so what she's saying is they've infiltrated political systems in the West and different institutions, whether they be academic, at the municipal levels as well. And they have integrated into society in large numbers and also in strongholds, right, in communities that stay in certain parts of larger urban city centers like London, but they haven't assimilated. So integrating without assimilating then sees the erosion of Western norms and values that the West has benefited from and flourished from and emanated from to the rest of the world for the last many, many centuries since the Enlightenment. So Sharia law. So in the UK, which she mentions that, the UK is on the brink of falling, Britain has emerged as the Western capital for Sharia courts, with 85 Islamic councils now operating across the country since they were first established in 1982. So they were allowed to establish as a recognized body or a council within the UK. And now this has created no-go zones, even within London, like streets and blocks of London are no-go zones, because if you cross into those areas, you're crossing into majority, if not complete, Muslim communities that adhere to Sharia law and reject municipal law or federal law. And essentially, as a Brit or as a white Brit, not to go into those areas. Crimes such as rape are really prevalent in these no-go zones. If you look into it online, you don't see much reporting on it, because to report about that would be Islamophobic. Ali has an amazing book called Pray, which I highly, highly recommend, where she talks about that again from her experience once being part of the Muslim world and now living in the West, and how Sharia law looks at just women alone, perhaps being a really great example on that clash between the Islamic bloc's worldview and the Western bloc's worldview. So speaking of women and the clash between Islamic and Western women, this video shows a British lady being confronted by a Muslim woman who is essentially saying, "Who are you trying to seduce with your clothes?" The British woman is actually covered quite modestly. Her shoulders and her knees are covered. But this clash in the video, I think, perfectly demonstrates and is, a microcosm of this larger cultural clash that we see happening in the West.
Do I look naked? Do I really? I don't look naked. You're trying to seduce? No one's trying to seduce me, and I'm not trying to seduce anyone. You shouldn't judge me how I try not to judge you.
She says, "You shouldn't judge me as I try not to judge you," the British lady. But what the West fails to understand, and what Europe has really failed to understand, is that that idea of tolerance does not exist in the Islamic worldview or in the Islamic bloc at large. And again, when I say these things, I'm not talking about individual Muslims. I know many of us might have even Muslim friends. I have many friends who are Muslim who live in the West, whether it be Israel or in the United States who I deeply respect and who deeply respect me as well and my Western norms and ideas. But at large, on a macro scale, there is a fundamental clash, and tolerance is not a pillar of Islam. Even though I think many people might try and disagree with me or say that's not true, I think that there is quite a bit of evidence to prove that that is just not, if it's not cornerstone, it's not a priority of the Islamic worldview. This next video is going to show, I believe this is some sort of celebration for Ramadan. Forgive me for not knowing what the specific like ritual or religious dance is, but I think it perfectly highlights what I'm about to contrast with you when it comes to Christian persecution in the UK, how religious minorities are afforded not just protections or the ability to have no-go zones where Sharia law then supersedes municipal or government law, but they're allowed to publicly express themselves in large numbers around major cities in the UK where Christians are not. And I think the freedoms and liberties given to Muslims in the UK versus the constraints and then the persecution of expressing your Christian views and ideas and even prayer silently being illegal in certain areas of the UK is a really alarming reality. Iconic visuals of the UK. You have the London Eye, you have Big Ben in the background, and you have these men performing, whether it's a religious or cultural, again, pardon me for not knowing, but some sort of outward expression of their culture and religion. Again, I believe this video was released around the time of Ramadan, which contrast what I was saying with the Christian persecution. Evangelism is not allowed in certain areas of the UK. There's this really amazing worship leader I watch. She's based in London. She'll do worship sessions on the street. And I've seen many videos where the police come up and say, you're not allowed to be singing, your Christian worship in public. And then recently, and JD Vance actually talked about Adam Smith Connor in his address that went viral to the EU when close to when the Trump-Vance administration took office back in January. I believe it was at the Munich conference. I believe it was in Munich. It was addressing the EU. JD Vance talked about this gentleman who was arrested in London, or was it in London, or it was in the UK, for praying silently near an abortion clinic. We've even seen Christians arrested here in the United States for, praying or trying to dissuade young women from accessing or going through with their abortion out of concern for the baby's life. And even if you disagree with abortion rights in the West, we do have the protection of being able to freely assemble and to freely speak and to freely pray for the unborn. And because the UK doesn't have a codified constitution, laws are constantly evolving. It's much easier to ratify. And we've seen laws in recent years try and limit the outward or even inward expression of Christian faith. So Adam was praying outside the abortion clinic. I believe his story is that he had actually gone through with an abortion with his girlfriend when he was younger. And so he was praying and speaking to his unborn son. And he was arrested and then charged with violating the law, which says that within a certain parameter of an abortion clinic, you can't pray. You can't even silently pray because you're committing a thought crime. And I believe certain areas within the UK also pass out flyers and pamphlets to homes that lie within the perimeter near an abortion clinic, stating that even if they prayed in their own home, they are committing a thought crime and violating the law. So we're seeing the persecution and the suppression of Christian prayer, even internally, like not externally or on a loudspeaker, but in their own minds. That is a thought crime. But to contrast that, at Ramadan, Muslims are allowed to have outward expressions such as this. And the captain says, Quran? Nope. And so we see certain parts of London looking more like the Middle East. And again, these individuals are allowed the religious liberty to worship publicly, but then Christians can't even pray internally in their minds, or it's a thought crime. And if that doesn't startle you, it really, really should. Even if you live in the United States and you don't feel the consequences of this in your communities, we have to look to what's happening in the UK and in Europe and this civilizational clash. And again, we also have governments. I mean, the UK is also extremely liberal. And you have the ideological left that has formed a really bizarre coalition with the Islamic community. But again, as I mentioned before, they share a similar vision to see Christendom and the West torn down. And so you also have different kind of pressure points in which Western norms and values and ideas and even Christianity are being persecuted in the public square. One last example of how the UK is being overrun by a rapidly growing Muslim population is the fact that Muhammad is now the number one name in England and Wales. This came out at the end of 2024, and birth rates and baby names are really good indicators of population changes and demographic changes within a country. And Muhammad has kind of been creeping up to the top. I think the prediction was that by 2030, Muhammad was going to be the number one boy name, but it actually reached that by 2024. So we're seeing the rapid Muslim birth rate in England as well, shifting the population demographics. And there are many who predict that the UK will, in the not too soon future, in the coming decade or so, be a minority of white Brits living within their mother country, which is a wild, wild statistic and phenomenon that is happening. But just a reminder that Sharia law and Muslim extremism and that fundamentalist Islamic worldview has not only shifted culture and society in the West and in Europe, but also in the Middle East. We can think of Iran before and after the revolution. This picture is, I believe this is from Afghanistan, but this image kind of stands as just a representation of what the Middle East was like in the 1960s and 1970s before radical authoritarian regimes and theocracies took over in the region. You have Iraq, Iran. I believe this photo is in Afghanistan. I want to say even today we see laws in Iraq being passed allowing 9-year-old girls to wed adult men, so child brides. But of course, why not? Because Muhammad married, I believe, a 7-year-old and then consummated his marriage with her at the age of 9. So if Muhammad is your authority, then a law in Iraq allowing 9-year-old girls to get married would make sense. In Afghanistan, the Taliban has now prohibited women from speaking in the public squares. It's part of many new vice and virtue laws, which sounds similar to the morality police in Iran. So just a reminder that women have also suffered in the Middle East because of these ideas, and unchecked and propagated or seized upon by authoritarian regimes have been used as a mechanism of control in the region, which is also one of the reasons why many people have fled the Middle East for Western countries. And so we cannot let Islamic norms and Sharia law shape the Western world, but we can promote and advocate for religious pluralism. Those things can exist, but we have to understand in the West that the idea of religious pluralism in and of itself is a Western norm. And so there is that inherent clash when two different worldviews that are diabolically opposed to each other try and coexist or try and, fight for authority. And I mean, even the war between Israel and Hamas is an example of that ideological clash today. And we're seeing it play out not just in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas and Gaza, but also in the West on our college campuses and in our political arenas. I hope you liked today's episode. Like I mentioned at the top of the episode, please like, comment, and subscribe, and follow us on X and Instagram. If you like the episode, please give it a like. And if you agreed, comment down below. If you disagreed, tell me why. I like to look at the comment section, and I will see you in the next episode.